stood at the edge of my family's backyard barbecue, watching my father Ralph wave his beer bottle toward the crowd of relatives gathered around him. His voice boomed across the suburban Texas lawn as he bragged about my brother Connor's new corporate law firm. "Connor's already pulling in 6 figures at Hartwell and Associates," he declared, then gestured dismissively in my direction. "Meanwhile, she thinks shuffling papers for tree huggers makes her a real lawyer." The family erupted in laughter. I smiled quietly, my fingers closing around the sealed envelope in my purse that would shatter every assumption they'd made about my worthless environmental law degree. 3 years earlier, I'd walked across that graduation stage at University of Texas Law School with hopes soaring higher than the Austin skyline. My cap and gown felt like armor, my diploma like a sword I'd used to fight injustice. But when I announced my intention to practice environmental law, the Johnson family celebration deflated faster than a punctured balloon. Ralph had cornered me after the ceremony, his face flushed with disappointment. "Environmental law? Annalee, honey, that's not real law. That's activism with a fancy degree." Connor's got the right idea, heading straight into corporate work in Dallas. Connor had graduated from law school 2 years before me, and had already secured a position at one of Dallas' most prestigious firms. While I was still studying for the bar exam, he was driving a BMW and closing deals worth millions. The family gatherings that followed became showcases for his success and silent reminders of my questionable choices. I'd set up my solo practice in Cedar Mills, a small town 30 miles outside of Austin, where rent was cheap and hope was cheaper. My office occupied the 2nd floor above Murphy's Diner, and the smell of bacon grease had become my unofficial cologne. Most nights, I'd work until dawn, surviving on ramen noodles and determination, while Connor posted pictures of his new mansion on social media. The cases that came my way were small at first, helping families fight illegal dumping in their neighborhoods, representing farmers whose crops were damaged by chemical runoff. Each victory felt meaningful, but the paychecks barely covered my student loans and office rent. For 2 years, family gatherings followed the same script. Connor would regale everyone with stories of his latest corporate merger while I sat quietly in the corner, picking at potato salad and deflecting questions about when I'd get a real job. Aunt Patricia would pat my shoulder sympathetically and suggest I consider switching to family law. Uncle Frank would joke about hiring me to fight his neighbor's loud music, then laugh like head-invented comedy. The breaking point came 6 months ago, when Chemcore Industries contacted my office. Not to hire me, but to deliver a cease and desist letter. It'd been representing 3 families in Cedar Mills whose well water had turned an alarming shade of brown. The letter, signed by a team of lawyers I couldn't afford to fight, warned me to stop making baseless accusations against their client. That night, I'd sat in my cramped apartment above the diner, staring at legal documents that seemed designed to intimidate me into silence. The families counting on me had children developing mysterious rashes and respiratory problems. Their livestock were dying. Their crops were failing. But Chemcore's legal team made it clear that pursuing the case would mean financial ruin for a small-town lawyer with more idealism than resources. I should have backed down. Any reasonable attorney would have advised their clients to accept Chemcore's modest settlement offer and move on. But as I looked at the photographs those families had given me, pictures of their children's medical conditions and their poisoned land, backing down felt like betrayal. The next morning, I'd called Chemcore's legal team and informed them I'd be filing a class action lawsuit on behalf of not just 3 families, but every resident affected by their illegal dumping practices. The case consumed my life for the next 6 months. I spent my savings on expert witnesses and environmental testing. I worked 18-hour days building a case against a corporation with unlimited resources and no conscience. Now, standing in my father's backyard while he mocked my career choice to anyone who'd listen, I fingered the envelope that would prove every sacrifice had been worth it. The settlement agreement inside represented more than money. It represented validation for every sleepless night, every ramen dinner, every family gathering where I'd been treated like the disappointing child who'd thrown away her potential on pointless causes. As Ralph continued his performance for the relatives, I realized this moment had been inevitable. My family had never understood that some fights are worth having regardless of the odds. They measured success by bank account balances and material possessions, while I measured it by the children who could now drink clean water and the families who could afford medical treatment for illnesses they'd never asked for. The laughter around Ralph's latest joke about my hobby law practice died down, and several relatives turned toward me with expressions ranging from pity to amusement. This was usually when I'd excuse myself to help with the dishes or find somewhere quiet to check my phone. But tonight felt different. Tonight I had news that would change everything. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, the envelope crackling softly in my grip. "Actually, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the humid Texas air like a blade. "I have some news about my tree hugger law practice." The backyard conversations stuttered to a halt. Ralph turned toward me with that patronizing smile he reserved for my rare attempts to defend my career choices. "Oh, really? Did you finally convince someone to pay you to save the spotted owl?" I pulled the envelope from my purse and held it up, letting the official letterhead catch the porch light. "I just won the largest environmental settlement in Texas history, $57 million. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the neighbor's air conditioning unit cycling on. Ralph's beer bottle stopped halfway to his mouth. Connor, who'd been scrolling through his phone near the picnic table, looked up with an expression I'd never seen before. $57 million. "Hello. I'm delighted to assist you with our voice services. Choose a voice that resonates with you, and let's begin our creative audio journey together." The family gathered closer, drawn by the gravity in my voice and the official documents in my hands. These weren't the traffic tickets and property disputes they'd assumed filled my days. This was real law, consequential law, the kind that changed lives. Families were losing everything to medical bills. I continued, my voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath. Children born with disabilities their parents couldn't afford to treat. Farmers watching their livestock die from poisoned water. Elderly people developing cancers at rates that should have triggered investigations years ago. Margaret, my stepmother, reached for the settlement papers with trembling hands. "How long have you been working on this case?" 8 months. I took it pro bono when every big firm in Texas refused to touch it. Chemcor's too powerful, too connected. The families came to me because I was the only lawyer desperate enough or stupid enough to fight a corporation with unlimited resources. Connor finally found his voice. "You fought Chemcor Industries alone? Annalee, they have teams of lawyers. They've got connections all the way to the state legislature. I know exactly who they have," I said, meeting his eyes. "I've been battling their legal team for months. They tried everything to bury this case. Frivolous countersuits designed to bankrupt me. Intimidation tactics against my clients. Burying evidence in procedural delays. They fought like their lives depended on it." Ralph set down his beer and stepped closer, his expression shifting from skepticism to something resembling respect. "How did you prove they were dumping illegally? Soil samples, water testing, medical records spanning 2 decades, testimony from former Chemcor employees who couldn't stay silent anymore, satellite imagery showing the dumping sites, internal company memos that somehow found their way to my office." The crowd around me had grown to include neighbors, who'd heard the commotion. Mrs. Henderson from next door leaned over the fence, her eyes wide with amazement. "You mean those chemicals are why the Henderson Creek turned that awful color last summer?" Chemcor's waste storage facilities leaked into the groundwater system that feeds Henderson Creek and 17 other waterways, I explained. The contamination spread through underground aquifers, poisoning wells and streams across 3 counties. What you saw last summer was just the tip of the iceberg. Jenny's husband, who worked in insurance, shook his head in disbelief. $57 million. That's more than most personal injury settlements in the entire state. It's not nearly enough, I said, my voice hardening. How do you put a price on a child's life? How do you compensate a family for losing their farm, their health, their future? The money helps, but it doesn't undo 12 years of poisoning innocent people. Ralph studied the settlement papers, his brow furrowed with concentration. Which law firm represented Chemcor? Must have been one of the big Dallas outfits. I felt the familiar knot form in my stomach. The same sick feeling I'd carried for weeks since learning the truth. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the revelation that would shatter more than just their assumptions about my career. "Hartwell and Associates," I said quietly. The words hit Connor like a physical blow. His face went pale, and the phone slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering onto the concrete patio. Connor's phone screen cracked when it hit the patio, spiderwebbing like the trust that was fracturing between us. He stared at me with eyes that had shifted from disbelief to something approaching panic. Hartwell represented Chemcore, Ralph asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Connor's firm. I nodded, watching my brother's face cycle through emotions like a slot machine searching for the right combination. For the past 8 months, while I've been fighting to get justice for poisoned families, Connor's colleagues have been working around the clock to silence them. The relatives who'd been crowding closer suddenly stepped back, sensing the family drama about to explode. Aunt Patricia clutched her pearls, literally. Uncle Frank whistled low under his breath. Connor finally found his voice. Annalee, you don't understand. I had no idea you were working this case. Hartwell takes on dozens of corporate clients. I don't handle environmental law. But you knew about my case, I said, my voice gaining strength. You knew because you asked me about it 3 months ago, remember? At Mom's birthday dinner? You wanted to know why I was working so many late nights. The memory hit him visibly. His shoulders sagged as the defensive walls had been building crumbled. I thought it was just another small-town pollution complaint. I didn't know it was class action. I didn't know how big it was. You knew enough to warn your firm about my investigation, I continued, pulling another document from my purse. This is an internal Hartwell memo dated 4 months ago. It specifically mentions monitoring the activities of solo practitioner Annalee Johnson and her nuisance litigation against Chemcore. Connor's face went from pale to green. Where did you get that? Chemcore's legal team had to turn over all communications during discovery. Your firm's strategy sessions, billing records, correspondence with Chemcore executives. I've read every email, Connor. I know exactly how Hartwell fought this case. Ralph grabbed the memo from my hands, his construction-calloused fingers fumbling with the legal terminology. As he read, his expression darkened. They called the sick families alleged victims seeking financial gain through fraudulent claims. That's just the beginning, I said, my anger building momentum. They hired private investigators to dig up dirt on my clients. Single mothers struggling with medical bills were portrayed as money-grabbing opportunists. Farmers losing their livelihoods were painted as incompetent business owners looking for someone to blame. Margaret covered her mouth with her hands. Those poor families. They tried to have 3 of my clients declared mentally unfit to testify. I continued. Elderly people suffering from chemical-induced cognitive decline were dismissed as unreliable witnesses. They filed motions to exclude medical testimony from doctors treating cancer patients, claiming the evidence was speculative and prejudicial. Connor stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Annalee, I swear I didn't know the extent of what the environmental litigation team was doing. Hartwell has different departments. I work mergers and acquisitions, but you knew enough to try talking me out of the case. I shot back. Remember our conversation after the Memorial Day barbecue? You suggested I consider corporate law, said environmental cases were career killers that never paid off. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Connor's mouth opened and closed without sound, a fish gasping for water that would never come. Ralph crumpled the memo in his fist. Connor, did you or did you not know your firm was fighting your sister? I knew Hartwell was representing Chemcore. Connor admitted, his voice barely audible. But Dad, you don't understand how these big firms work. We have Chinese walls between departments. I'm not supposed to know what environmental litigation is working on. But you did know, I pressed. And you never thought to mention it? Never thought to warn me I was going up against one of the most ruthless legal teams in Texas. The backyard audience was riveted now. Family drama playing out better than any television show. But this wasn't entertainment. This was my life. My career. My fight for justice being dissected in front of people who'd spent years dismissing my choices. Jenny's husband broke the silence. So Connor's firm was trying to destroy Annalee's case. Worse than that, I said, pulling out another document. They were trying to destroy my clients' lives. This is a motion filed by Hartwell requesting sanctions against me for frivolous litigation designed to harass a respected corporate citizen. Connor's head snapped up. Sanctions. They wanted me disbarred, Connor. Your colleagues tried to end my legal career to protect Chemcore's profits. They argued that I was incompetent, that I was filing baseless claims without proper evidence, that I was exploiting vulnerable families for personal gain. The words hit their target. Connor staggered backward, bumping into the picnic table. I had no idea they filed for sanctions. I swear, Annalee. If I'd known, what would you have done? I challenged. Would you have stood up to senior partners? Would you have risked your six-figure salary and your BMW to help your sister fight for poisoned families? Ralph stepped between us, his face flushed with anger, but I couldn't tell if the anger was directed at Connor or at me for attacking his golden child in public. This is getting out of hand, he said. Connor, did you know your firm was trying to get your sister disbarred? Connor shook his head, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. No. But even if I had known, Dad, what was I supposed to do? Quit my job? Betray my firm's confidences? Annalee chose to take on an impossible case. That's not my responsibility. The words stung worse than I'd expected. Not because they were cruel, but because they revealed the fundamental difference between us. Connor saw legal work as a business transaction. I saw it as a calling. You're right, I said quietly. It's not your responsibility to fight for justice. But it was your responsibility to tell me I was going up against my own brother's firm. As the family absorbed this betrayal, I prepared to deliver the blow that would shatter whatever remained of our illusions about the Johnson family legacy. Because Connor's professional betrayal was nothing compared to what I'd discovered about Ralph's role in poisoning our own community. The construction records in my briefcase would prove that this conspiracy reached deeper than anyone imagined. Ralph was still holding the crumpled memo when I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with construction documents. The sight of official paperwork seemed to trigger something primal in him, the same fight-or-flight response I'd seen when building inspectors showed up at his job sites. Speaking of responsibility, Dad, I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake I was about to unleash. We need to talk about Johnson Brothers Construction's involvement in this case. The color drained from Ralph's face faster than water from a broken dam. What are you talking about? I opened the folder and pulled out the first document, a construction permit dated 15 years earlier. Johnson Brothers Construction built the illegal waste storage facilities that Chemcorp used for dumping. The backyard went silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and Mrs. Henderson's wind chimes. Ralph's beer bottle slipped from his fingers, shattering on the patio with a sound like breaking promises. That's impossible, he said. But his voice carried no conviction. We built dozens of projects for different companies. We followed the blueprints we were given. I held up a series of invoices, each one bearing the Johnson Brothers logo that had once filled me with pride. 17 separate projects over 8 years. Concrete storage tanks, drainage systems, and containment facilities. All built without proper environmental permits. Margaret stepped closer to Ralph, her eyes searching his face for denial that never came. Ralph, what is she talking about? These invoices show payments well above market rate for basic construction work, I continued, my courtroom voice taking over. Chemcorp paid Johnson Brothers 3 times the going rate for concrete work. Why do you think that was? Connor moved to stand behind Ralph, family loyalty overriding professional rivalry. Annalee, you're making serious accusations. Higher payments don't prove anything illegal. I pulled out another document, this one bearing Ralph's signature. This is a non-disclosure agreement signed by Ralph Johnson, agreeing to maintain absolute confidentiality about all construction projects for Chemcorp Industries. The penalty for breach of confidentiality was $50,000. Ralph's hands shook as he recognized his own signature. Son of a gun. I forgot about that NDA. But Annalee, honey, I didn't know what those facilities were for. Chemcorp told us they were water treatment tanks. Water treatment tanks built 30 feet underground with no drainage permits. I challenged. Water treatment tanks constructed with chemical-resistant concrete and sealed with industrial-grade rubber linings. The evidence was mounting like storm clouds, dark and ominous. Ralph looked around the backyard as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. Uncle Frank, who'd worked construction his whole life, whistled low. Ralph, those specifications you're describing aren't for treating water. Those are for storing hazardous materials. I nodded toward my uncle, grateful for his expertise. Chemcorp needed someone to build secret storage facilities without asking questions. They found a small, local construction company desperate for big contracts during the recession. The recession, Margaret whispered, understanding dawning in her eyes. Ralph, that's when you started working nights and weekends. When we suddenly had money for the kitchen renovation and the new truck. Ralph's defensive walls were crumbling like poorly mixed concrete. We needed the work, Margaret. The housing market had crashed. Half the construction crews in Central Texas were going bankrupt, so you built illegal dumping facilities and kept quiet about it, I said. My prosecutor's instincts taking control. Even when families started getting sick. Even when children developed cancer. Even when your own daughter started investigating Chemcor's illegal dumping, the accusation hung in the humid air like a guilty verdict. Ralph's eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of remorse or self-pity. Connor stepped forward, his loyalty to Ralph overriding his shock. Even if Dad's company built those facilities, that doesn't make him responsible for what Chemcor put in them. I pulled out the final document, the one that had kept me awake for weeks since Id discovered it. This is a change order dated 3 years after the original construction. Ralph's signature authorizing modifications to increase the storage capacity of the underground tanks. Ralph's knees buckled. Margaret caught his arm, steadying him as the weight of his complicity became undeniable. The change order included specifications for additional chemical-resistant coatings and enhanced sealing systems, I continued. By then, Ralph knew exactly what those tanks were storing. The change order even mentions industrial waste byproducts in the specifications. The family circle that had gathered to mock my environmental law practice now stood in stunned silence as the true scope of the conspiracy emerged. Ralph had helped build the facilities. Connor's firm had fought to cover up the contamination. The Johnson family had profited from both sides of the crime that poisoned 15,000 innocent people. Jenny broke the silence, her voice small and scared. Uncle Ralph, did you know people would get sick? Ralph's shoulders shook as 20 years of buried guilt finally surfaced. I thought Chemcor knew what they were doing. I thought big companies had safety procedures. I needed the money, Jenny. We were going to lose the house, the business, everything. So, you chose money over the health of our community, I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to remain professional. You built the infrastructure that allowed Chemcor to poison our neighbors, our friends, My phone rang, interrupting my confrontation with a sound that cut through the family drama like a fire alarm. I glanced at the caller ID and felt my heart stop. Sarah Martinez, my childhood best friend who still lived in Cedar Mills. I have to take this, I said, stepping away from the family cluster. Sarah's voice was shaking, barely recognizable through her tears. I need you to come to the hospital. It's Emma. My blood turned to ice. Emma was Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, the little girl who'd played in the same creek where Connor and I had spent our summers. Who'd grown up drinking from the same wells that Ralph's construction company had helped contaminate. What happened? I asked, though I already knew the answer would destroy me. The doctors say it's leukemia, Sarah sobbed. Emma has childhood leukemia. They want to start chemotherapy immediately, but Annalee, the treatment costs. I don't know what we're going to do. I sat in the sterile hospital waiting room, watching Sarah pace between plastic chairs, while her husband Marcus held their sleeping toddler son. Emma was 3 floors above us, having blood drawn for additional tests to determine the exact type of leukemia ravaging her 8-year-old body. The irony was suffocating. Thanks to my settlement with Chemcor, Sarah's family would receive compensation for medical expenses and pain and suffering, but no amount of money could undo the damage to Emma's bone marrow or erase the terror in her parents' eyes. She was complaining about being tired for weeks, Sarah whispered, her voice hollow. The pediatrician kept saying it was normal for kids to have low energy, growing pains. Maybe she needed more iron in her diet. I reached for Sarah's hand, remembering the countless summer afternoons Wed spent as children, swimming in Henderson Creek and drinking from the old well behind her grandmother's house. The same creek that Chemcor had poisoned. The same well that had been feeding contaminated groundwater to families for over a decade. The oncologist showed us her blood work, Marcus said, his voice thick with exhaustion. Her white blood cell count is through the roof. They need to start treatment immediately. Outside the hospital window, news vans were setting up in the parking lot. Word of my settlement had leaked to the media, and reporters were descending on Cedar Mills like vultures on roadkill. The story had everything they craved: corporate corruption, environmental disaster, David versus Goliath legal battles. My phone had been ringing constantly since Id left the family barbecue. Dallas Morning News wanted an exclusive interview. Environmental groups were offering support and resources. Other law firms were reaching out to partner on similar cases across Texas. But sitting in that hospital room, watching my best friend grapple with her daughter's diagnosis, the media attention felt obscene. This wasn't a victory to be celebrated. This was a tragedy that should have been prevented. Annalee, Sarah said, pulling me from my thoughts. How long have you known about the contamination? The question hit like a physical blow. The case against Chemcorp began 8 months ago. But Sarah, I had no idea the contamination reached your neighborhood until recently. The underground aquifer system spread the contamination much farther than anyone realized. 8 months, she repeated, processing the timeline. Emma started getting sick about 6 months ago. The implication was clear. If I'd worked faster, if I'd pushed harder for emergency medical testing of affected residents, if I'd forced Chemcorp to notify the public sooner, Emma might have received earlier medical attention that could have made a difference in her prognosis. Marcus looked up from his sleeping son. The doctors said childhood leukemia cases in our area are running 3 times higher than the national average. 3 kids on Emma's street alone have been diagnosed in the past year. I felt the weight of responsibility crushing my chest. Those 3 children had played in contaminated soil, while I'd been fighting legal battles in air-conditioned courtrooms. They'd been drinking poisoned water while I'd been filing motions and conducting depositions. My phone buzzed with a text message from Connor. Need to talk. Meeting with Hartwell Partners in 1 hour. Career on the line. I showed the message to Sarah, who read it with narrowed eyes. Your brother works for the firm that tried to cover this up. Yes, I admitted, shame coloring my voice. And my father's construction company built the illegal storage facilities that made the dumping possible. Sarah's expression shifted from sympathy to something much colder. Your family profited from poisoning my daughter. The accusation hung in the antiseptic hospital air like a toxic cloud. There was no defense, no justification, no way to soften the brutal truth that my family's greed and willful blindness had contributed to Emma's suffering. Sarah, I had no idea about my father's involvement until today, I said. When I started investigating Chemcorp, I was fighting them as much as anyone else. She turned away, staring out the window at the news trucks gathering in the parking lot. But you knew your brother's firm was fighting against your case. You knew the Johnson family was involved on both sides of this disaster. Marcus shifted his sleeping son to his other arm. Annalee, we've been friends since kindergarten. But right now, I need you to leave. We need time to process this. I gathered my purse and legal documents, my throat burning with unshed tears. The settlement money will cover Emma's treatment and provide additional compensation for your family's suffering. I'll make sure you get the maximum amount possible. Money won't cure her cancer, Sarah said without turning from the window. Money won't give me back the nights I spent wondering why my healthy daughter was always exhausted. Money won't erase the image of her tiny arm covered in bruises from blood draws. I left the hospital with my heart shattered and my phone ringing constantly. The Dallas Morning News had somehow obtained internal Chemcorp documents showing Ralph's construction company had been paid over $2 million across 8 years for building and maintaining illegal waste storage facilities. The headline on their website made me sick. Environmental lawyer's family profited from contamination she fought. By the time I reached my apartment above Murphy's Diner, protesters had gathered outside the building. Environmental activists were demanding accountability from the Johnson family, while Chemcorp supporters accused me of orchestrating a family conspiracy for financial gain. I climbed the stairs to my apartment and found Connor waiting outside my door. His usually perfect hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he clutched a manila envelope in his shaking hands. They fired me, he said without preamble. Hartwell and Associates terminated my employment effective immediately for conflict of interest and failure to disclose material information. I unlocked my door and gestured him inside, too exhausted for anger. What material information? Connor slumped into my kitchen chair, the envelope falling to the table between us. They found out about Dad's construction company during their damage assessment meeting. Apparently, Chemcorp's corporate counsel has been reviewing all contractor relationships since the settlement was announced. I poured 2 glasses of water from my filtered pitcher. Ironic, given the circumstances. So they fired you to distance themselves from the scandal. Worse, Connor said, accepting the water with trembling hands. "They're claiming I withheld information about family connections to the case. They're threatening to report me to the state bar for ethical violations." The envelope on my table seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. "What's in there?" Connor's face crumpled. "Security footage from my office building. They have video of me entering your law office last week after hours." My blood turned to ice. "You broke into my office." The admission hung between us like a confession of murder, destroying whatever remained of our sibling bond. Connor's hands shook as he pushed the envelope across my kitchen table. "I was desperate, Annalee. Hartwell's senior partners called an emergency meeting after news of your settlement broke. They were panicking about potential liability for representing Chemcore." I stared at the envelope like it contained a loaded weapon. "You broke into my office to steal case files." "Not steal," Connor said quickly. "I was looking for anything that might implicate Dad's construction company. I thought if I could remove that evidence before Hartwell found out about the family connection." "You tried to destroy evidence in a criminal case," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Connor, that's obstruction of justice. That's disbarment. That's potential prison time." The security footage envelope seemed to burn my fingertips as I opened it. The black and white images showed Connor using some kind of key to enter my building at 11:43 p.m., then leaving an hour later with what appeared to be documents in his hands. "How did you get into my office?" Connor's voice was barely a whisper. "I still had your spare key from when you were sick with pneumonia last winter." The betrayal cut deeper than his collision with Chemcore or his family's mockery of my career. This was personal violation, brother against sister, trust shattered beyond repair. "What did you take?" I demanded. "Construction invoices and permits from Dad's company," he admitted. "I thought if those documents disappeared, there'd be no way to prove his involvement." I felt my world tilting off its axis. Those documents weren't just evidence in a civil case. They were proof of criminal environmental violations that could send Ralph to federal prison. "Connor, those files weren't just for the civil settlement. I've been cooperating with a federal criminal investigation of Chemcore for 3 months." His face went gray. "Criminal investigation? The Environmental Protection Agency and the Department of Justice have been building a case against Chemcore's executives for knowing violations of the Clean Water Act and the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. The evidence you tried to steal could have determined whether anyone goes to prison for poisoning 15,000 people." Connor doubled over like Id punched him in the stomach. "I didn't know about the criminal case. I thought it was just the civil lawsuit. Did you destroy the documents?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table with shaking hands. "No. I couldn't do it. When I got home and actually read them, when I saw Dad's signatures authorizing chemical storage modifications, I realized what we'd become." I opened the folder and breathed a sigh of relief. The construction records, permit applications, and change orders were all intact. The evidence that would hold Ralph accountable was safe. "There's something else," Connor said. "Hartwell isn't just firing me. They're throwing me under the bus to protect themselves. Tomorrow morning, they're holding a press conference to announce that I withheld material information about family conflicts and that my unethical conduct compromised their representation of Chemcore." The irony was stunning. Hartwell was destroying Connor's career to distance themselves from the scandal that their own aggressive tactics had created. My phone rang, interrupting our confrontation. The caller ID showed Special Agent Patricia Reeves from the EPA's Criminal Investigation Division. "Miss Johnson? We just received word that your brother attempted to remove evidence from your office. We need to speak with him immediately." I looked across the table at Connor, whose face had gone from gray to green. "Agent Reeves, my brother is here now. He has the documents in question and he's ready to cooperate fully with your investigation." Connor's eyes went wide with panic, but he nodded slowly. The weight of his choices was finally crushing down on him. "Bring him to our Austin field office first thing tomorrow morning," Agent Reeves said. "And Miss Johnson? The grand jury hearing on Chemcore indictments has been moved up to next week. Well, need you to testify about your father's construction company's role in building the illegal dumping facilities." I hung up the phone and studied my brother's face. For the first time in our lives, he looked older than me. The golden child who'd never faced real consequences was about to learn that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with family connections or expensive lawyers. "What happens now?" Connor asked. "Now you tell the truth," I said. "You testify honestly about what you knew and when you knew it. You take responsibility for trying to obstruct a federal investigation. And you hope the prosecutors are more interested in Chemcor's executives than in a desperate lawyer who made terrible choices." Connor nodded, resignation settling over him like a burial shroud. "What about Dad?" I thought about Ralph's construction company, his illegal contracts with Chemcor, his willful blindness to the environmental devastation Head helped create. I thought about Emma Martinez lying in a hospital bed, her young body fighting cancer that should never have existed. "Dad's going to face federal charges for environmental crimes," I said. "Conspiracy, knowing violations of federal environmental laws, probably racketeering charges if prosecutors can prove ongoing criminal enterprise. Prison. Probably. Ralph's cooperation and testimony against Chemcor executives might earn him a reduced sentence. But Connor? He built the infrastructure that poisoned 15,000 people. Federal judges don't show mercy for environmental crimes that harm children." We sat in silence as the magnitude of our family's destruction settled between us. The Johnsons had been involved on every side of the environmental disaster that was about to make national headlines. Ralph had built the facilities. Connor had fought to cover up the contamination. I had exposed the conspiracy that would destroy us all. My phone buzzed with another news alert. Chemcor's stock had dropped 23% in after-hours trading. The company was facing not just my civil settlement, but potential criminal charges that could result in billions of dollars in fines and prison sentences for executives. Connor stood up slowly, moving like an old man despite being only 34 years old. "Annalee, I know apologies don't fix what I did, but I need you to know that. I'm proud of you. You did the right thing even when it meant destroying your own family." The words should have felt like vindication, but instead they felt like ashes. I'd won the biggest environmental case in Texas history. But the victory had cost me my brother's career, my father's freedom, and my childhood friendship with Sarah Martinez. "Get a good criminal defense attorney," I said as Connor headed toward the door. "Not from Hartwell. They've already thrown you away to protect themselves." After Connor left, I sat alone in my kitchen with the recovered evidence spread across the table. The construction invoices, permit applications, and change orders that would send Ralph to prison. The security footage that showed Connor's attempted obstruction of justice. The settlement agreement that would compensate 15,000 victims of corporate greed. Justice was coming, but it tasted bitter as poison water. The next morning's Dallas Morning News would feature a front-page story about the Johnson family's role in the environmental disaster that was reshaping Texas politics. The headline would read, "Environmental lawyer's father built illegal dumps, while brother's firm covered up contamination." But buried on page 7 would be a smaller story that meant more to me than any headline. Emma Martinez had responded well to her first round of chemotherapy. Her doctors were cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. Sometimes justice arrives wearing work clothes instead of a black robe, carrying construction tools instead of a gavel, speaking in a child's laughter instead of legal precedent. 2 years later, I stood in the same backyard where my family had mocked my environmental law degree. But everything had changed. The barbecue was smaller this time, quieter, marked by the kind of careful conversations that happen when families have been through hell together. Ralph had served 18 months in federal prison for environmental crimes, had lost 40 pounds, gained gray hair, and found something approaching humility in a place where his construction company connections meant nothing. He spent his days now doing court-ordered community service, teaching sustainable building practices to young contractors and speaking at environmental conferences about the real cost of cutting corners. Connor had avoided prison by cooperating fully with federal prosecutors, but his legal career was effectively over. No firm would hire an attorney who'd attempted to obstruct a federal investigation, regardless of the family circumstances. Head started over with a small practice in Cedar Mills, taking pro bono environmental cases and working to repair a reputation that might never fully heal. The civil settlement had distributed $57 million to affected families across 3 counties. Emma Martinez was in remission, her medical expenses covered by the compensation fund I'd established. Sarah and I were slowly rebuilding our friendship, though some wounds heal more slowly than others. Margaret had filed for divorce during Ralph's prison sentence but had surprisingly withdrawn the paperwork a week before his release. 25 years of marriage doesn't disappear because your husband makes terrible choices, Shed explained. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. We're starting over, and this time, I control the finances. I'd moved my practice to a larger office in Austin, hiring 3 associates and a paralegal to handle the flood of environmental cases that had followed my victory against Chemcore. The settlement had established my reputation as the attorney who'd take on impossible cases against powerful corporations, and my phone rang daily with new clients seeking justice against industrial polluters. The broader impact extended far beyond Texas. My case had inspired new federal legislation strengthening environmental enforcement and increasing criminal penalties for corporate executives who knowingly violate clean water standards. 3 other states had used my legal strategies to successfully prosecute chemical companies for groundwater contamination. Chemcore Industries had paid over $400 million in federal fines and faced ongoing criminal prosecution of its executives. 2 company vice presidents had been sentenced to federal prison, and the CEO faced trial for conspiracy and racketeering charges. Annalee, Ralph said, approaching me near the same spot where Head mocked my law degree 2 years earlier. His voice was softer now, worn down by experience and humility. I wanted you to know that the community service coordinator asked me to speak at the University of Texas Law School next month about environmental crimes and corporate responsibility. I studied my father's face, searching for signs of the arrogant contractor who'd once dismissed my career as tree-hugger activism. Prison had changed him in ways I hadn't expected. The Ralph who'd taken shortcuts for profit had been replaced by someone who understood the real cost of environmental destruction. "What will you tell them?" I asked. "The truth," he said simply. "That every signature on those construction contracts represented families I was helping to poison. That every dollar Chemcore paid me came from the suffering of children like Emma Martinez. That greed makes you blind to consequences until it's too late to undo the damage." Connor joined us, carrying a beer in one hand and legal documents in the other. His expensive suits had been replaced by khakis and polo shirts. His BMW traded for a used Honda Civic. The golden child was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that success built on silence about others' suffering was no success at all. "I filed 3 new environmental cases this week," he said, showing me the documents. Groundwater contamination in Bastrop County, illegal dumping in Williamson County, and air pollution violations at a chemical plant in Harris County. "Any of them against big corporations?" I asked. Connor smiled ruefully. "All of them. Apparently, I have a talent for fighting powerful opponents with unlimited resources. Wonder where I learned that." The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Connor had discovered that environmental law was more challenging and personally rewarding than corporate mergers, even if it paid a fraction of his old salary. Head found purpose in protecting the same communities Head once helped victimize. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Martinez. "Emma's cancer markers are still clear. Doctor says she's officially in long-term remission. Thank you for never giving up." I showed the message to Ralph and Connor, watching their faces as they processed the good news. Emma's recovery had become a symbol of hope for our entire family, proof that some damage could be healed even if it couldn't be undone. "You know what I learned in prison?" Ralph said, breaking the silence. "There are no small actions when it comes to protecting the environment. Every choice matters. Every shortcut has consequences. Every signature on a contract affects real people with real families." Margaret approached our small circle, carrying a newspaper with a front-page story about Texas' new environmental enforcement legislation. "The Dallas Morning News is calling it the Johnson Act," she said, showing us the headline. "Named after the environmental lawyer whose case changed everything." I read the article describing how my victory against Chemcore had inspired legislative reforms that would prevent future environmental crimes. The law required construction companies to obtain special permits for building chemical storage facilities, increased penalties for corporate executives who knowingly violate environmental laws, and created victim compensation funds for communities affected by industrial pollution. Annalee Johnson's courageous fight against corporate environmental crimes has made Texas a national leader in protecting communities from industrial pollution, the article concluded. Her willingness to fight her own family's involvement in environmental destruction proves that justice sometimes requires personal sacrifice. Connor raised his beer in a toast. "To the Johnson family. We may not be the richest anymore, but we're finally fighting on the right side," Ralph nodded slowly. "To making amends. It's never too late to do the right thing." I thought about the long journey from that first family barbecue where they'd mocked my environmental law degree to this moment where we were united in fighting for environmental justice. The path had been painful, marked by betrayal, prosecution, imprisonment, and the near destruction of our family relationships. But sometimes the right choice requires breaking everything down before you can build something better. Emma Martinez ran across the backyard, her hair grown back in soft curls after chemotherapy, her eyes bright with the energy of a healthy 8-year-old. She launched herself into my arms, nearly knocking me over with her enthusiasm. "Aunt Annalee," she shouted, using the honorary title shed bestowed on me after her recovery. "Mom says you're the lawyer who saved me." I hugged her tight, feeling the solid warmth of a child who should have died from corporate greed but had lived because someone was willing to fight impossible odds for justice. "No, sweetheart," I said, setting her down gently. "You saved yourself by being stronger than any sickness. I just made sure the people who made you sick paid for what they did." Emma nodded seriously, her young face showing wisdom beyond her years. "Mom says you fought your own family to help us. That must have been really hard." I looked around at Ralph, Connor, and Margaret, at the family that had been broken by greed and slowly rebuilt through accountability and truth. "Sometimes fighting for what's right means fighting the people you love most," I said. "But families are strongest when they're built on truth instead of lies, on justice instead of profit, on protecting others instead of protecting only themselves." As the Texas sunset painted the sky in shades of hope, I realized that my family's mockery of my environmental law degree had led to the most important victory of my life. Not just the legal victory against ChemCorp, but the personal victory of choosing justice over family loyalty, truth over comfortable silence, and the long-term health of my community over short-term profit. The Johnson family had learned that real success isn't measured in bank account balances or expensive cars, but in the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it costs everything you thought you wanted. Id started as the disappointing daughter whose law degree was dismissed as useless paperwork. Id became the attorney whose impossible case changed environmental law in Texas and protected thousands of families from corporate pollution. But most importantly, Id learned that sometimes the greatest victories come from the battles you never wanted to fight, against opponents you never wanted to face, for principles that matter more than personal comfort. The law degree my family had mocked had become the weapon that saved my community and ultimately redeemed my family. Justice had arrived wearing work clothes instead of robes, speaking in children's laughter instead of legal precedent, and proving that one person's courage to fight impossible odds can change everything. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? How do you handle situations where the people closest to you are involved in something you know is wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that standing up for justice sometimes requires personal sacrifice, please hit that like button to support more stories about courage and redemption. Don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring tales about ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when it matters most. And please share this story with others who need to remember that doing the right thing is always worth the cost, even when that cost is everything you thought you wanted. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that your voice matters when it comes to protecting your community and holding powerful people accountable for their actions.